Welcome everyone. Today is a solemn day. Today is a mythical day because it is the 2774th anniversary of the creation of Rome by Romulus. And it is very fitting that on this mythical day, we're going to be talking about mythic loot in general, because Blizzard has expanded the tooltips of the soon-to-be available trinkets in the new raid Sanctum of Domination in 9.1, and then of course also the ones from Tazavesh, the Mega Dungeon. Trinkets are very important. In case you haven't noticed, trinkets are not like any other piece of your gear. Most of the other pieces on your gear are just going to be based on item level. Is this piece bigger item level than my old piece? Yes, I'm gonna use it. And it ends there. Sometimes you have some decisions to be made based on your secondary stats. For most of the other part of your gear, it's no longer things like Azerite armor, where you were stuck with a 415 piece because it had the correct traits, even though you had 445 pieces in your bags or something like that. It's mostly about item level, not as much when it comes to trinkets. Trinkets are unique because they have special effects, they allow you to do special things, and throughout the expansions we have gone through several very powerful trinkets, which have warped, sometimes even the power of an entire spec, and made it much more powerful. Sometimes those were trinkets that were used past the first tier they were implemented in. That's usually the trademark, the hallmark of OPness when it comes to trinkets. Some of you will remember very recently something like the Ajara's Font of Power, the unused trinkets for, burst classes. Very heavy dependence on big cooldowns, going very well together with this trinket. Even further back you had Abominations, like Convergence of Fates, heavily skewing the cooldowns of very powerful abilities, as well as something like the Draught of Souls for melee specs, together with the evergreen, the unstable Arcana Crystal from Legion. You also had things like the Prophecy of Fear. From Manoroth you had the Anarim Vigil of Lei Shen, all the way back in Throne of Thunder, and those were very powerful, spec-defining, sometimes role-defining trinkets that everyone wanted. Now, surprisingly enough, at the start of Shadowlands, we did not really have some insanely broken trinkets that everyone was fighting for, that everyone wanted. Multiple people jumping on the same key in Mythic Plus because it dropped the trinket, or maybe in raids, everyone just waiting to get that trinket. We didn't really have that so far. We had some specs targeting a certain trinket, the unstable device for burst specs. Some people want the changeling, but those are just minor trinkets in terms of power compared to what we used to have before. It is also true that pretty much every one of the trinkets I've showed you came from later on in those expansions. It was never in the first tier. It was never one of the trinkets that you found, for example, in Uldir or in Highmole. It was always the second or maybe the third tier, the third raid, which gave you these type of trinkets, which is a good time to go and look at the trinkets now, because we are getting into the second raid of Shadowlands, and the time could be ripe to have a very powerful trinket sought after by many classes and specs and roles. The only caveat I would put out for this first tier of Shadowlands is actually, ironically, not for DPS, because it's the Splintered Heart of Alar for tanks, which is a cheat-death mechanic, and the Tuft of Smoldering Plumage for healers, which is also a cheat-death mechanic, although it's a little bit harder, to proc properly, sort of like Guardian Angel for Holy Priests, but not really too much for DPS. So let's go over on what Blizzard has expanded on when it comes to trinkets for 9.1. The first one has a very cool alternative effects, which we don't know anything about. The Forbidden Necromantic Tome passively increases your damage. Also, when you die, become a semi-lich for 20 seconds. Now, we are starting to go down a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole of be alive even after you die, now that you can go as Necrolord with Bonesmith Harmir and stay alive for 10 seconds. Now you can have a trinket which apparently can keep you semi-alive for 20 seconds, and maybe you can be a Holy Priest with a Rest legendary that is just gonna bring you back to life after. Of course, this is just a curious effect, but we don't really know any type of numbers or what even being a semi-lich means. A much more straightforward trinket, which is good because it comes from the first boss, so it's farmable. It's grindable by a way bigger part of the player base, is the Tome of Monstrous Constructions. Study the tome to increase your damage done to the targeted enemy. Studying an enemy removes the benefit of any prior studies. So it's going to be very good on any fight, which is going to require you consistent single target damage, which is going to end up being pretty much every single fight in any raid. At some point, even in the more heavy AoE fights, you will have to focus a primary target for quite a bit of time. Even something like Stone Legion Generals, which is very chaotic, still has plenty of single target focusing to be done. And as I said, it's very important that this comes from the first boss, a very easily targetable boss. Also, from your vault, more and more chances to get this. Another one, this one is way more dangerous though. This is way more risky. We don't know the numbers yet, so we don't know how traumatic this could be, but the Scrolled World of Recall. Blizzard is saying, reset or lower the cooldown of a spell you already cast, picked by spec. This is, troublesomely reminding you of some of the things you have had in BFA, like the Memory or Lucid Dreams, discounting you or giving you extra energy or resource regen. In some cases, the resource regen were the charges of, for example, some of your abilities. There are several specs which are significantly empowered by being able to get discounts on their charges for their abilities. Of course, we are talking here, one of the main culprits of this was Fire Mage, pretty easy example. And also worth mentioning again, this is a pretty early on boss, so it's gonna be a pretty easily obtainable trinket. So if it's a very powerful one, it's pretty key that it's gonna be early on. Then we have the Shadowed Orb of Torment. It's an unused trinket. Torment yourself with the orb to gain greater insight into the patterns of reality, increasing your haste. So a whole lot of words just to say it's a haste unused trinket. This is very good. It is very good because there are quite a few specs that want an unused secondary stat trinkets, and most of the time this type of unused trinkets crave haste. And guess what? Castellnatria had none of it. Even Mythic Plus dungeons didn't really have anything like this. They had something like the Inscrutable Quantum device, which could potentially give you something like this, given that haste was your primary major secondary stat. But this is much more straightforward. It's an unused intellect trinket giving you haste. Now, unfortunately, for some of the other specs that want this type of unused trinkets but are agility or strength based, this doesn't seem like it's gonna be for you, unfortunately. Then on to another intellect trinket with a more flavor for execute phases. The Ebon Soul Vise is telling us that it's gonna be doing shadow damage over time to your target, with the duration being increased with the target's missing health. So of course, stronger effectiveness if it is in execute phase, basically closer to that, below 30 probably percent HP is going to hit the sweet spot for this trinket. It's another interesting one. It's going to gain, of course, way more value whenever you're fighting a boss that has a very problematic, a very key last phase, a very key execute phase. This is going to be a very powerful trinket. Then we have a healing trinket, the Carved Irony Keepsake. You have a chance to have foreseen damage taken by your allies, healing them instantly for fixed damage when they take damage. A very chill, passive healing trinket for your throughput. You're gonna put them on, and then they're gonna do some 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 or 7% of your total healing if they're very powerful, and you just forget about them. You won't have to micromanage them, you won't have to min-max their usage, their unused effects. It's just put them in the background and let them do work. This can always be just a fine trinket, based on how it's tuned. Another one of these passive trinkets is going to be the Resonant Silver Bell for healers. You are accompanied by a Spectral Familiar. When you heal a target below a fixed percentage of health, the Familiar will rush to them and heal them for another fixed number. Cannot occur more than once every 30 seconds. This seems more likely less effective, simply due to the fact that it's going to fixate on a single target, especially because, let's just say, this only procs at a target below 30% HP. It is very likely that the person is going to be capped in HP, even over-capped in HP, over-healed, because multiple healers are gonna, notice that the target is low HP, so they're gonna go and rush to heal him, and by the time your trinket is actually acting on it, it's gonna be over-healing. And the fact that it has a 30-second internal cooldown is also pretty bad. So just from the wording, without any sort of numbers, it looks like it's gonna be worse than the other one of the passive trinkets for healers. Unfortunately, worth mentioning, so far there doesn't seem to be any one of these crazy unused trinkets for healers that saves people's lives. Just like the Tuft of Smoldering Plumage from Kel'Thas in Castellnatria, it might even be, unless Blizzard fixes it or breaks it or something, that healers will continue to run the Tuft of Smoldering Plumage in the next raid, because it is literally a lifesaver. And you're going to be gladly missing on 20 or 25 intellect from a higher item level trinket, if it means you can keep your raid from having a player dying because you have that trinket. Then we have our first multi-spec trinket, which is the Titanic Ocular Gland. This is going to be pretty good if it ends up being good for many specs, because it means it can be traded very easily, since every single player is basically going to be eligible for this trinket. Unfortunately, understanding if it's worth, right now it's impossible, because the text for the trinket is, while you are worthy, gain stat. Yeah, what does it mean, being worthy? What does it mean, the stat? Generally speaking, when it comes to stat, it's either your primary stat or your highest secondary stat. So we can guess that part. What we can't guess is what does it mean to be worthy. I don't know, my first guess was if your health is above 90%. This is a type of thing we have seen before. As I mentioned, if it is going to be a very good trinket for several specs, it's good because it's multi-spec, multi-role, so it's gonna be very easy to obtain, to trade around. Now let's go on to our 3 tank trinkets. Now, tank trinkets do get away with having a cheat death. Unlike the healers who lose their cheat death trinket, tanks still remain with one. And this is going to be the Weave of Warped Fates. However, this Weave of Warped Fates has a very weird text explanation of what it does. On use, it says, if you barely died, use within 3 seconds of death to unwind your fate, returning yourself to life. So this could point towards being able to use an item while you're dead, which is a first, at least in like raid encounters. The barely dead part could be something related to the amount of damage you're taking. We have gotten this before with immunities. Abilities that prevent you from dying are not going to work if the damage you're taking is massive. It's never been specified how massive does it have to be, but it looks like this could be the case. So it's a pretty interesting way of making it work. Either way, if it works like it reads, I guess, it is another cheat death mechanic for your tank. Now, what is also weird is that now tanks would be able to have a cheat death mechanic trinket from the Keltas fight and a cheat death mechanic trinket from Sanctum of Domination. I wonder if very likely Blizzard is just going to put both trinkets on the same cooldown to just prevent tanks from doing this. As for the other tank trinkets, we have the Reactive Defensive Matrix. It's an equip trinket, not on use. Taking damage as a chance to trigger damage reflection shields. Always gain a damage reflection shield when your health drops below 20% HP. 20% HP is pretty low. It's pretty dangerous to be gaining any effect with this trinket. And the fact that it procs randomly, generally as a tank, you want to have very clear windows of taking reduced damage. Very easy to spot windows. So this is not looking like it's very reliable for a tank. Maybe in more consistent and often windows of heavy damage for a tank like Mythic Plus, this can gain more value. But, you know, we have to know, first of all, how often does this proc, and second of all, how much of this damage reflected is. If it has a cap, how long it lasts, you know, we don't know yet. As for the other tank trinket, we have the Shard of Anhilde's Aegis. Use, shield yourself from damage in front of you for 10 seconds. Again, exactly the same thing. We don't have the cooldown for this, first of all. Second of all, we don't know how much of the shielding is going to be. Very likely it's something based on your strength, maybe scaling with versatility, something like that. It just depends on the number. You know, is it worth using? Is it not? That's about it. It is, though, better than those randomly proccing trinkets because it gives you an on-use, stronger defensiveness, stronger resilience in the tough parts of a pull in Mythic Plus, in the tough parts of a boss in raids, so could be pretty good. Now, as for the DPS trinkets, for strength and agility, we have the Decanter of Endless Howling. I am very into the tooltip, by the way. Very cool seething garrosh picture. Equip, your critical hits have a chance to increase your primary stat, occurs more often based on missing health. A key part of this trinket would be if it has a cap. Yes, your critical hits can increase your primary stat, but how often? Like, how high can this go? If it can go very high, then this is going to be pretty good for specs with a lot of crit. Specs that prioritize crit in their build and crit very often are going to gain a lot of value from this trinket. Then we have the Tormented Rack Fragment for strength and agility users. Your attacks have a chance to deal shadow damage over time to your target. If a target dies while affected, its soul shreds, which you can pick up for crit. Now, the secondary effect, of course, is going to get very likely more value in Mythic Plus. It's also interesting to see if this is going to work like it looks like You pull 10 mobs, you Bladestorm, you tag all 10 mobs with this. Are they gonna spawn 10 souls for you to pick up to gain 10 crit buffs? I don't know. It sounds cool though, as an effect. Another one of the DPS trinkets, importantly this time, it's an on-use trinket. The Salvage Fusion Amplifier. Empower your weapons with the Fusion Amplifier, causing your attacks to deal additional arcane damage and look freaking sweet for 20 seconds. Now, more often than not, this is going to be very bad for many specs. Very bad because its trinket duration is 20 seconds, which means the power of this trinket is spread all throughout the 20 seconds. So it's going to be very low. Comparatively speaking, for example, with a trinket that only lasts for 8 seconds, or maybe an unused trinket that does damage, like the Dreadfire Vessel from the Nathrius. How many specs for strength and agility do have a cooldown that buffs them for 20 seconds, that makes them strong for at least 20 seconds? You have Retribution Paladin with Wings, you have Assassination Rogues with Vendetta. That's it, it's over. That's the amount of power you can get for 20 seconds. Maybe even Feral Druids with Incarnation, maybe, but that's it. Many other specs from Unholy to Frost to Outlaw to Enhancement Shaman, even Windwalker Monk, unless they back-to-back Stormlight and Fire, don't have this type of a duration, so it's unlikely this trinket can become as powerful for many of these specs. So the only question about this trinket that's left is just how freaking sweet is freaking sweet? What does it mean? Who knows? Then we have an agility-specific trinket, the Relic of the Frozen Wastes, which says your attacks have a chance to deal frost damage and mark your target. This effect stacks. On use, you can summon an Erubian to attack your target. It deals damage based on the amount of stacks on the target. And after you use this, your Equip effect cannot keep stacking while the trinket is on cooldown. Pretty interesting effect, and this is what I mean when I say specs with very short burst. This is a good trinket for spec with a short burst. Specs who don't care about 20 or 30 second long buffs, but they just want to have a much bigger and larger damage increase quickly. This could be good, depending on the numbers. Although, to be fair, it's agility only, so the amount of specs that can benefit from this is pretty small. And then lastly, we have a couple of strength-based trinkets. The Whispering Shard of Power. Ner'zhul's whispers will compel you to make decisions for power. They might hurt you, but there must always be a number go up. Very likely this is one of those take some damage to yourself, maybe even slow your movement speed, something like this, and in return, you gain a buff. Primary stat, secondary stat, damage increase, something like that. Again, this could be very good depending on how much it lasts. Many specs would rather have, for example, a 5-second or an 8-second massive buff over a 30-second long-ish type of buff, so this could be very good for those specs. Unfortunately, just like for agility, this is just a strength-based trinket, so not many specs can benefit from this. Lastly, you have the Old Warrior's Soul. Of course, fittingly, drops from Sylvanas, since it's, Saurfang's Soul. Equip, gain Undying Rage and Endless Duty. Undying Rage, while in combat, your rage builds, increasing your haste by a fixed amount every 10 seconds. Endless Duty, when a nearby ally's health drops below 50%, you can sacrifice a portion of your health to heal them for that same portion. So technically a DPS trinket, but also has some, utility/healer effects, I guess. Could be pretty good with the ramping haste increase. We have seen before ramping haste trinkets being very good. This seems to be a longer ramping up because it ramps up every 10 seconds, so it's pretty slow in terms of ramp up. Doesn't look like it's one of the fast ones, but it could still be pretty good. And with this trinket, these were all the trinkets for the raid part of the trinkets available in 9.1. We do have a bunch of trinkets from Tazavesh. However, it is much less relevant, basically, from 9.1 because Tazavesh is going to be released as a mecha dungeon, which also means it's going to be released in normal raid difficulty from Sanctum of Domination. TLDR 226 item level. So if they keep the same thing they did with Mechagon, for example, just to be clear, it's gonna be 226 item level. When you will be able to do, Mythic plus 10 or 12 or 14 or Heroic raid and get already, for example, 239. So it's unlikely any of these trinkets is going to stay relevant for the first tier. Then the next tier in 9.2, when very likely Tazavesh is going to be split into two and turned into two different Mythic Plus keys, then the trinkets can start becoming, relevant usable. But for now it's unlikely any of these trinkets is going to be used at high level anyways. So that's where we are going to stop for the day. I'm going to leave you with a PSA for all the, I guess, hopeful flavor of the month chasers thinking Elemental Shaman will be the new thing for 9.1. This is the week, after a month, this is the week where Valinor is available, which means Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence is available, which is the best in slot legendary for Elemental Shaman. In most scenarios, most single target scenarios, that's the legendary you want, so go and kill Valinor if you want that. And on another side note, it's also Final Verdict's legendary available for Retribution, which is the best in slot single target legendary for Retribution Paladin. However, I don't know why you would be rolling a Retribution Paladin hoping for it to be flavor of the month. I can safely recommend you that it is not going to happen. There is a much higher likelihood that Elemental Shaman would be better. So, you do you. If you want to play a Red Paladin for 9.1, I'm not gonna judge. And after this PSA, we can call this a day. Thank you guys for watching as usual. You should subscribe to this channel, but if you don't subscribe, 100 more days of this week of Mythic Plus will fall upon you. So you have been warned. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, one of them is there. One of these broken OP trinkets, which will break several specs, is lying somewhere, and I'm just waiting to see which one.